Is the new Evangelicals podcast a Dr. Michael Heiser fan? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel. I've been watching a lot of uh, the new Evangelical podcast episodes on YouTube, been listening on their podcast, and I gotta say, I like a lot of the conversations that they're having. I disagree with some, agree with others, just like many, and just like many that they bring onto their podcast to have conversations with. One of the ones I really liked recently was their conversation about Dave Ramsey, both his theology and such, and wholeheartedly was on board with that because I wrote my doctoral project for my D-Min at Fuller on how to help my denomination's pastors save enough for retirement. And lo and behold, what I found out was, the common traditional advice of, just get a 401k and throw your money in there and everything will be all right. Well, the very, advice that Dave Ramsey gives to everybody, well, that ultimately, according to Teresa Ghilarducci, author of Rescuing Retirement, she says, yeah, that's causing what she refers to as the American DIY retirement crisis. Basically, as a result of switching from pensions to 401ks in the late 70s, early 80s, we lost one of the legs of our retirement stools, right? And 401ks really were more of an experiment than a proven thing. And she's like, it's been 40 years, 40-year experiment. We see it's a 40-year failure. They don't do what we're asking them to do, or they don't do really what everybody says that they do, like Dave Ramsey. And so Dave Ramsey perpetuates advice that then perpetuates the American DIY retirement crisis, um, ironically. And yet he is the main voice in Christian finances. And so one of the things I conclude is we need other voices in the Christian finance world that are not him, but probably more theologically informed and also informed and what the advice that they give as well as more biblically informed in terms of framing what we're trying to do, both be as the church overall, but also with our finances in terms of the Jubilee, because that's how Jesus's ministry was framed in terms of Jubilee in Luke, and the beginning of the church was framed in terms of Jubilee as well. So we are a Jubilee community, a Jubilee living by a Jubilee politic, making sure everybody has enough as what they need, like we see the Christians doing in Acts chapter 2 after the first 3,000 people were baptized after Peter's first sermon. I could go on and on and on about that, but um, again, Dave Ramsey stuff. Ultimately, what Ghilarducci said is like his advice is for rich people. That's why you see such other organizations, newspapers, etc., give the exact same advice that Dave Ramsey gives. They're all geared toward people who have predominantly more money than many other Americans. And as a result, by following that advice, there's going to be, according to Ghilarducci, millions and millions and millions of retired poor or near poor by, let's say, 2050, with all the boomers finally retiring and Gen X is starting to retire, right? All right, so I'm going to stop with that. But I love their conversation. I wanted to send them, I've wanted to do this. I wanted to send them my paper, my final project, so that they could like just have it, see if it helped them have another conversation. But I appreciate that conversation that they had, and there's others that I really like. But there's one conversation that particularly I disagree with, and we'll get to that. Um, but basically, here's one thing that I saw as I was listening throughout their conversations and their episodes and their podcast, and that was I saw. Um, that they interviewed Dr. Michael Heiser in like one of the earliest episodes of the podcast, in episode 9. Like we we now we know that Dr. Heiser passed away. What? How long has it been now? Has it been over? It's been over 2 years. It's been over 2 years since he passed away. So this was before Dr. Heiser passed away 2 years ago. And when I saw that they interviewed him, I was like, yes, because it was like finding a little bit of buried treasure because I hadn't heard that episode before because I really appreciate Dr. Heiser's perspective in theology and work. So I ate that one up. I really appreciate T&E interviewing him. And one of the things that Tim said was in the portion of the episode after Heiser had done the interview and left, he and his co-host were having a conversation, and Tim said that this was the first time he had heard and learned about the proper supernatural way of reading Genesis 6. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. That was the first time that you, Tim, had heard that. And it's probably the case for most people who hear Dr. Heiser or who are going to listen to that episode. And I really appreciate Tim and the New Evangelicals bringing Dr. Heiser on for that conversation because he is right that one of the one of the negatives of like fundy evangelicalism or just the American church, conservative American Christianity, is that they missed the boat on some stuff theologically in terms of how to read the Bible, and all of us didn't know this until Heiser's and others stuff has come along, and well, Dr. Heiser made it known through his amazing ministry by taking what is known in academia and making it known in the pew, right? Which is like all of us who go study in academia or seminary and beyond. That's what we want to do. And that's what we try to do. Sometimes it's successful, other times you lose your job, right? Um, but I appreciate Tim bringing him on. I love that episode. And we all need Dr. Heiser's theology and work, both conservative, fundamentalistic American evangelical Christians, as well as, let's say, progressive or whatever you want to call the left side of the spectrum Christians here in America. Okay. And so, but here's an interesting juxtaposition. Heiser was interviewed in episode 9. And then I think the very first conversation on the podcast, the official T&E podcast, was an episode where they talked with somebody about, the topic of LGBTQ, inclusion, etc. And T&E takes the standpoint, the position that, hey, this conversation is basically over. There is no more conversation. You should include all LGBTQ persons into the life of the church. They're as fully Christians, they can fully participate, etc., etc. So they are fully affirming, and then some. It seems like when you listen to T&E and their official position. All right, and as I was looking through the several hundred podcasts, I saw that about 5% of T&E's episodes are on this topic, at least according to the title of each of the episodes. I'm sure the subject comes up in more than just those 15. It has in some that I've listened to that don't have a title related to that subject. Okay, but it's an interesting juxtaposition, and it made me think and ask this question: hey, what if affirming and fundamentalistic or fundamentalist Christians applied Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview to their sexual ethics? That's the question I posed when I wrote a paper about 5 years ago. The last class that I took for my DMin degree at Fuller Theological Seminary was writing how does what's his name? I can't remember who wrote A Secular Age. Charles Taylor, there it is. How does Charles Taylor's concept of disenchantment intersect with Romans 1 and intersect with uh, Dr. Heiser's work, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview or the Divine Council worldview? And that was a fun little foray in those, 35 pages that I was able to write. And these conversations on my channel here are the fruit of trying to continue that conversation and engage with those who are having this conversation as well from different viewpoints. But what if we do that? What if T&E did that? What if fundamentalistic Christians in America did that? What if they applied Heiser's theology to their sexual ethics, what would happen? Well, here's one thing. What would we see? One thing both sides would see is that they would see that Genesis 6 through 9, the flood story, and Genesis 19, the Sodom and Gomorrah story, they would notice that, these two stories are paired together in multiple times throughout the rest of the biblical story, Old and New Testament. And they would also notice parallels between these two stories in Genesis. All right? So what kind of parallels are we talking about? What kind of parallels are present? Well, there's a simple structure that one could notice between the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9 and then the story of destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. And that structure is right here before you. There's a sexual encounter that begins both of these stories. You have the sons of God and daughters of Ben who procreate together and bear the Nephilim or giants. And in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, you have two angels that move on from visiting with Abraham and go to Sodom and Gomorrah and interact with Lot. Lot takes them into their home that evening, and they're the ones who ultimately save Lot and his family and bring about the destruction of the city. All right, but the men of the city try to sleep with those two angels that they don't, at least doesn't seem the story is letting on that they know are angels. They think they're men. And then you have a judgment scene after what happens with the sons of God, daughters of Ben and Nephilim. Then it says, and then everyone was wicked, and God's like, all right, I need to send the flood. And we know through Heiser's work that the flood wasn't sent ultimately to stop humanity. It was more so sent to stop the work of the sons of God and Nephilim upon the earth, because Heiser discusses this thing that we call, or that is called, the Enochian teleology of evil. All right, and we'll get to that again in a minute. But there's a judgment in the flood. The flood stops the wickedness and evil of humanity, the sons of God, and the Nephilim. And then in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, obviously, the two angels bring about the destruction of the cities of the plain after Lot and his family escape. And then at the end of these two stories, you have this sexual encounter of, what is it, Ham, Noah's son? Either Noah's son sleeps with him while he's drunk, or the idiom could be that Ham slept with Noah's wife as a means of trying to take over the clan while Noah was drunk. Either way, there's a sexual encounter. In the end of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, you have Lot's two daughters sleeping with Lot and producing Moab and Ammon, which ultimately end up becoming two of Israel's biggest enemies during the time of Israel in the Promised Land. And so you have an interesting, simple structure there going on there. But what do we see based upon that structure? Where it seems like Genesis is begging us to see how these two stories compare, contrast, and relate to one another. And it seems as though, in light of what Dr. Heiser has taught and others have written about, is that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah, by trying to sleep with the angels, were acting in a manner quite parallel to the watchers in their actions with the daughters of men in Genesis 6. And therefore, one thing perhaps that we can garner from the intended comparing and contrasting of the stories by the original authors of Genesis is that Torah is teaching humans not to act like the watchers. That is something I think that can be drawn from the beginning of Genesis here. That Torah is teaching humans not to act like the watchers, and watchers being a term used in the book of Enoch to refer back to the sons of God of Genesis 6. Okay? That's one thing we could see. Okay? What's another thing we could see? We could see Galatians 3 and 4 and its conversation that Paul has about the law. Heiser, in his book, Reversing Herman, talks about and says this. Heiser looks at another academic article that dives into what Paul's getting at here when he discusses the law and mentions how it was put in place because of transgressions. And this author that Heiser quotes says Paul's argument about the role of the law in Galatians 3:19 through 4:11 is influenced by an Enochian teleology of evil, which basically means that it's not just in Genesis 3, which is the reason and why the world is the way it is, and it's all messed up because humans sinned. But, as Heiser many times before mentioned, the world is messed up, yes, because of human sin, but also because of the rebel spiritual beings we call the sons of God or watchers, and the depravity that they instilled and implemented into and influenced on earth within humanity as a result of their actions in Genesis 6. And so, one of the things Heiser draws out from this other scholar's work is that the law was added because of transgressions, and yet whose transgressions? Well, at first, because of transgressions means to restrain transgression. To restrain the transgression of humanity, sure, of Israel, yes. And the backdrop of those comments being the Enochian teleology of evil was the law was added to restrain the transgressions that humanity and Israel most likely intended to live like and do as a result of what the Watchers, sons of God, did and started back in Genesis 6. So, in some sense, based upon Heiser's chapter here in Reversing Herman and others' work, you could say Torah was intended to keep humans, Israel, humans in general, but especially let's say Israel. Torah was intended to keep Israel humans from watchering. Torah was intended to keep Israel to live like humans, like they were intended to live, intended to act as imagers of God, imagers of Yahweh, and not do what the Watchers did in terms of their sexual sins, their false teachings, and everything that stemmed and flowed from that, that First Enoch talks about and dives into. So Torah was intended to keep humans from watchering, if you excuse my term that I'm using there. But I think that's helpful. At least it's helpful for me when I think about this. Okay, what else could we see? What else could we see? We could see 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, and this phrase, because of the angels. Why did Paul say that the women needed to do this and wear a veil because of the angels? This is a passage that, I don't know, can get messy in terms of how people read it. And it's a passage that those on the left side of the spectrum of Christianity can say, "Oh, nobody understands this. It's not really saying what it's. It's really people don't understand what it says." And then vice versa. This is just one of those battleground passages. Um, but Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview, his divine council worldview perspective, um, on top of him just kind of connecting the dots using other people's research to help us get at, okay, what was Paul's perspective and background for saying what he said here to the Corinthians? And one of the things he said within this chapter in Reversing Herman is the covering for women was committed to protect women from sexual scandal in society because women's hair in that society was equivalent to their genitalia, right? And that culture, the way they thought, like you wouldn't go to church exposing your genitalia, would you? So that's why you need to wear a head covering, all right? So it was committed to protect women from sexual scandal in society, as well as supernatural violation by angels. And this dual rationale focused on social boundaries and sexual vulnerability, along with the precedent of angelic violation of women in the past. So women not only were to cover their heads because of cultural norms, they didn't want to offend people who weren't Christians, as well as Christians who were meeting together as part of the church there in Corinth, but also because it seemed Paul was thinking We know what happened in the past in Genesis 6. We don't want that to happen again. So wear a veil because of the angels, because of the sons of God, because of the watchers. Angeloi most likely being a synonymous term referring back to the sons of God and watchers. So in essence, what Heiser is saying here is that Paul is trying to prevent women from getting watchered, if you will, or a term that you hear a lot of times being used on the T&E podcast. Paul is trying to prevent women from being dehumanized. Because think about what the watchers intended by doing what they did in Genesis 6. It was dehumanization. And what is one way of thinking of dehumanization? Well, it's thinking that their intent and purpose was to get humans to de-image. Their intent was to get humans to anti-image God, not image and do the things that God created humans to do to mirror and represent the true creator, but it was to get humans to act in such a way as to mirror and image them, right? And to become anti-imagers, to dehumanize God's greatest creation, right? And so if we want to have a conversation about dehumanization, we must talk about the watchers and what their intent and purpose and doing what they did in Genesis 6 and moving forward throughout all the rest of time, particularly still today. Because we see Jesus confronting them, let's say on Holy Saturday coming up in just 2 days, and we see him confronting the fruit of their actions, the demons, the spirits of the dead Nephilim, within his very ministry, to prevent the dehumanization of those whom they went into, right? And to put a stop to their actions on earth once and for all. Okay, so that's another thing we could see. So in essence, one last thing we could see. Baptism in 1 Peter 3:14 through 22. When we look at baptism, Peter's words in this passage, Heiser says the spirits in prison that Peter mentions are those imprisoned watchers of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, infamy. And that when we're baptized, and that baptism for every Christian, especially those first Christians who had this supernatural worldview as like their foundation, it was understood and assumed, they thought when they went to go get baptized, early Christians, they denounced Satan and all his works, right? That's one of the things they did when they were right as they were being baptized. But they thought that when they were being baptized, it was a reiteration of not only, let's say, like the flood, or we're doing this because Jesus did it, but it was a reiteration of the past and future doom of the watchers in the wake of the gospel, right? We were basically pledging our lives to Jesus. It was both a positive affirmation of pledging our lives of allegiance to Jesus, as well as a affirmation and pledge to not live like the defeated watchers of Genesis 6, and not live by that very depravity that they instilled and influenced into the world, into humanity. That is one way to think about baptism in light of steadily building back this ancient supernatural enchanted worldview of the ancient Hebrews and first century Jewish Christians. So it's kind of cool. It revivifies the meaning of baptism. At least it did for me, and I think it's done that for others as well. So, what do we do? Well, yeah, the problem. The problem is this: the average evangelical, ex-evangelical, post-evangelical, or whatevs evangelical. You like that term? I like it. I think I'm going to stick with it. Use that. Maybe make it my new title for my YouTube channel. Who knows? It's probably already taken. But the average Christian in general in America is supernaturally disenchanted, meaning they don't read and interpret sexual ethics in this light. They don't read the Bible in this light. Especially, they don't read the passages that discuss sexual ethics in this light. Okay? Yeah, I didn't before I came across Heiser like 6, 7 years ago. And I'm still trying to apply and use that as a lens to read all the scripture, but especially these passages about sexual deviancy and sexual ethics in scripture, like Sodom and Gomorrah, like Genesis 6, like 1 Corinthians 11, and so forth. All right, so what do we do with this problem? How do we have a better conversation uh, between Christians along the spectrum and become more united in how we think about sexual ethics? All right, instead of constantly having this civil war of like affirming versus non-affirming, side A versus side B, and so forth and so on. What do we do? Well, here's what I guess one of the things we can do. This is my last slide. Okay, so right or wrong, I don't know. I just I think this is one way to take this. If you have an affirming theology, it's almost like you have a pro-watcher theology. Stay with me here. It's those in the kind of left-leaning progressive camp spectrum of sexual ethics, the logical end of the road conclusion of an affirming theology would look back at Genesis 6 and say, hey, you know what they did? That that was okay. It would be a watcher affirming theology, namely what they did back in Genesis 6 is good. It was good because hey, watcher love is love. Let them be, you know? We should put a W in the LGBTQ plus A, or I'm sorry, we should put a W in there somewhere for watchers. I'm not trying to be cute here. I'm trying to have a good, serious theological conversation and take what Paul, the Torah, and others, like Peter and Jude, consider to be very, very serious and apply it to the conversation and reasoning in this conversation that we're having about sexual ethics here in the American church. So what it seems, though, that Heiser's divine counsel worldview, it seems to help us see that the same-sex sexual behavior as a parallel breaking of cosmic boundaries within an Enochian teleology of evil. So same-sex sexual behavior is on par or parallel with the behavior of what we see the sons of God watchers doing in Genesis 6. And if whatever we're doing is parallel to them, it's obviously not good. And Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed not just because of the sexual nature of the sins in of the men of the city there. They were destroyed for many different reasons and many different sins. That sexual nature of their sin was just being highlighted, right? Sexual sin is often highlighted in many passages, including, let's say, Romans 1. Okay, and so when you think about it that way, hopefully it makes people pause on both sides of the aisle, right? On both sides of the spectrum, on both sides of the issue, and think, okay, if we truly seriously take Heiser's theology and divine counsel worldview, Deuteronomy 32 worldview seriously, and we really like it, and it seems like people on both sides of the aisle on issue do, then what happens when we actually apply it and read these passages about sex in the Old and New Testament the way they were actually meant to be read in light of the Enochian teleology of evil? Some pretty cool things could happen, and some pretty big aha moments can happen for every Christian, no matter where they're at in their understanding right now. And so I'm going to conclude this video here and leave it at that. And I really hope you liked this video and you got something from it. I hope to be back sooner with a new video, a little bit sooner than this one. But I'm going to be out for now. Thanks for watching to the end, guys. Take care, and we'll see you later. Goodbye.